can you refresh our memory about what a variant is and why they happen and what Omicron is?
So basically, every time a virus replicates, it will mutate. That's just the nature of what viruses do. They mutate very, very rapidly. Now, most of those mutations don't have any functional significance in terms of they're not beneficial, they're not deleterious to the virus, they're just kind of neutral. Some will have a deleterious effect on the virus, so it might actually mean that the virus replicates less well, for example, and some might be beneficial to the virus, so it might mean that the virus spreads better. And it's all what mutations are generated are all a little bit of process of random chance. But what we do know is that the more opportunities you give the virus to replicate, the more likely you are to see those mutations emerge, because you can't have a mutation emerge if there's no replication. So it's perhaps not surprising, given the sheer number of people that we've seen infected with COVID-19, that we've seen numerous viral variants emerge. And viral variants just refer to viruses that have accumulated a few of these mutations along the way. Now, when we talk about variants, there's lots of different variants, but we're particularly interested in what we call variants of concern. And these are variants that have known mutations that we know from experimental studies are associated with things that are significant in terms of transmission, in terms of evading an antibody response from the vaccine, and really things that we know are likely to have a functional consequence. So this variant Omicron was detected and it was sequenced, and we found that it had these certain genetic markers that we've known in the past have been associated with increased transmission and evasion of the antibody response. So this was quickly marked as a variant of concern, and globally people have been looking for this variant and trying to accumulate data on this variant as to what's going on. It's still very, very early days. So even though we know that this has a certain genetic signature, just because you have the genetic signature, that doesn't mean that that will hold true. It's sort of a prediction. So at the moment, we don't have enough data to say if this variant is more transmissible than, say, Delta, and we don't have enough data to say how the vaccines protect against this variant. So at the moment, it's not a cause. It's sort of that thing when you need to be alert but not alarmed. It's something we need to watch, definitely, but there is no evidence to suggest that, the end is nigh, this is disastrous. We just have to watch and wait.
Omicron is the 15th letter of the Greek alphabet, we're told. So why do we name them this way? And does that mean that there were 14 variants before? And why do we only know about Alpha and Delta and now Omicron?
So we named them this way because initially they were called after places that they were first detected. So you had the Wuhan isolate, the South African variant, the UK variant. But that was seen as sort of a bit unfair insofar as that was naming them after the place that they were first detected. That's not necessarily where they emerged, and there was a certain stigma associated with that. So that naming system got ditched, and we went for the scientific nomenclature, which is how we as virologists refer to the virus. But unfortunately, these names are hideous, and we were talking about things like B.1.6.17.2, and that just doesn't roll off the tongue. So then the WHO made a decision to go with the Greek alphabet and to name all the variants after the Greek alphabet. You are correct in noting that there are, because we're up to Omicron, this means that there's been multiple variants before. And this relates back, some of them you will have heard of, like Alpha and Beta. Some of them you might not have heard of, like Kappa, Epsilon. These are all been variants of concern. And this is where I was saying to you that we can look at a genetic signature and say that there are things about that virus that mean we have to watch it, but that doesn't mean that it's actually going to be significant in the real world. So some of these variants have emerged and we've seen, hey, they've got certain mutations, we need to watch them. but they haven't actually done anything and they've just kind of faded away. So that's why you've probably only heard of a few of the variants, because they're of significance. The exception to that is actually Omicron was meant to be named New, because that was the next letter in the Greek alphabet. But the WHO decided that that was too confusing because it was the new variant versus the new variant. So they actually skipped that. And then the next one was actually meant to be Xi. I pronounce it the Chinese way, but I don't know how you pronounce it the Greek way, XI. But that was decided to be skipped because that was a really common surname of a lot of people. So there was a negative connotation there. So then we ended up at Omicron. So it's a bit of a clunky naming system, but there is a rationale behind it.
Perhaps one of the reasons why there's been so much identification of SARS-CoV-2 variants in South Africa is because they've got a pretty amazing viral epidemiology kind of system. They've got a lot of virologists there. They've got lots of research in the HIV space and all of those sort of things. They've actually got a really incredible system for finding these variants.
That's exactly right. And, you know, it is actually amazing how much we're detecting these variants. And the analogy I'll have is in 2009 with swine flu. Flu mutates actually much better than coronaviruses. So they would be, if we tracked the variants in that pandemic, we would have seen so many more variants and we would have run through about 6 Greek alphabets. But the sequencing technology wasn't really available then. And so it was just much more difficult to sequence, and it was only done in a handful of countries. So we just didn't follow the variants like we do now. So it is really a reflection on how far genomic technology has come.
Can we make any kind of predictions around restrictions or even whether current vaccines will protect us against Omicron?
Look, I'm a scientist, so I'm always going to say I want to see the data. I would be very, very hesitant to make any predictions based on the data that's currently available. There's maybe a little bit of epidemiological data that suggests that it could be more transmissible, certainly than the ancestral virus. I think that's probably something we could speculate on. But in terms of evasion of the antibody response and vaccine response, that's something that we actually need to study in the lab. So those data, it takes about 2 weeks to do those sorts of experiments and at least start getting some insight. So we should start seeing some data come out. But also, you know, that's looking at whether the virus can evade the antibody response. And that's all well and good as a sort of lab experiment. But you also want the real world data where you see, hey, are vaccinated people getting infected with Omicron and are they doing worse or better? And of course, that data takes a lot longer to acquire. So I think it's very, very early days. And this is why I say it's not something that we should panic about. It's just something we need to be aware of.
Mm.